Book Awards. So we have a very honored and decorated author here with us today. But in addition to these awards for his writings, his other honors include awards from the Royal Entomological Society in London, the Lepidopterist Society, and the Society for Conservation Biology. So it's a delight to have you here today, Bob. And I guess I'd like to ask you, before we launch into a more general discussion, is there a passage you'd like to read to sort of set the stage for our discussion today?
Thank you, Dave, and thank you for that gracious introduction. And yes, I'll do that. Thank you for the invitation. The book we're discussing is Sky Time in Grays River. The first edition was a pretty thing that came out from Houghton Mifflin originally. And later on, Dave, I think you're going to ask me about the origin of the book, so I'll save that story until then. But it's recently been republished, brand new edition, revised by Counterpoint Press in Berkeley, with a pretty new picture of the covered bridge in our valley. And I have to say, if people are on the what's it called, where you can see everybody, Veronica has a beautiful landscape behind her, which I assume, Veronica, must be Floridian. It must be around Sarasota. Is that right? Where's the river? Is it there? Oh, you're muted. Yes. Well, I will say that the picture behind you could easily be Grays River. It looks very much like the river in my valley. But I'm going to begin with a short passage from the early part of the book. I'll read two other passages later on, all brief, to, as you say, Dave, set the scene. This is from the pre-chapter called Before Times, Going to Ground in Grays River. Walking to the compost this morning, I was arrested by the sight of a leaf pinioned on a rush spike. The bunch of rushes grows in a pot in the corner of the heather garden. The leaf was birch, clear yellow, spattered with remnant green. It hung there, impaled, as it fell from the tall white wand of the birch. Shivering on the light November air, the leaf was like a moment of grace before the fall. The compost heap shone bright with still more leaves of maple, oak, and hornbeam, spattered among bracts of Brussels sprouts, over the hill red currants, and the collapsed brain pan of a jack-o'-lantern, the exuviae of a satisfied autumn and its festivals. Returning to the house, I paused, as always, to rinse the white chamber pot in the spray of a standing spigot. But just before tossing the water onto the heather, I noticed a struggling spider in the chilly swirl. Spiders up spouts suffer a well-known fate, and so it had. But rescued with an oak leaf, it unfolded just fine. And when I placed it on the spigot post, I saw a rotund female of another species, a big native orb weaver, hunched up under the handle. The skinnier one crawled back into its shelter, apparently uninjured by the dunking. So the two spiders had been there together at this late stage, somehow surviving the harsh frosts and heavy rains of recent mornings. Now, as I approached the back porch, a Steller's jay rocketed off, screaming that the kibbles were all gone from the cat's dish. An elegant Anderson slug, slender, yellow-rimmed, reticulated, gilded, and glided away from the bowl too. From the doorway, I noticed a flutter in a tall English oak by the drive. The first-year Townsend's warblers that had come for Thanksgiving were still here, flickering through the tawny foliage together, while chickadees and kinglets loitered off to the side. The migrant warblers' lemony breasts and faces were as bright as the slug's mantle. Their presence was as unexpected as a pair of spiders in late autumn, their gift as sudden and fleeting as a birch leaf on a rush spike. Now, none of this is high adventure, but it meets my hope for a home where boredom remains at bay. I live where I do so I can look out or walk outside at any time and instantly be within nature. Of course, one is in nature everywhere, since there is nothing else. But I mean a place where you can actually see all the swallows depart on a certain day in the fall, and see the first arrivals in the spring in all their joy and relief, and know there is nothing sentimental in saying so. See rufous hummingbirds working the sparse nectaries of blood currants while they wait for the salmon berries to break bud. Watch the early vultures ride the airs above the treetops, and the bald eagles, whose nest in a cottonwood top was blown away by last winter's winds, start in again to soar, to hunt, to feed their young in a brand new nest. See the bleeding hearts fan out, the trilliums crack, the banana slugs strike out from their cold weather hideaways for fresh pastures of moss, and the first spring azures appear on what Robert Frost called Blue Butterfly Day. These things are as important to me as love, and in fact, that's what they are. And actually, Dave, I'll go ahead and tell that little anecdote about the origin of the book, because it fits right there. I was working at the time writing for Houghton Mifflin Publishers in Boston, and I had a wonderful editor there, Harry Foster. I did 6 books with. And I'd finished the Bigfoot book, and then a book called Chasing Monarchs, in which I followed the migration of the monarchs. And I wasn't sure what was coming next. And Harry wrote me and he said he had heard from one of their marketing people. We tend to talk about the marketing people in publishers as if they're just bean counters and almost illiterates, but that's not the case. A lot of the marketing people in publishing got there because they love books too. And this one certainly does. His name is Clay Harper. He's still in publishing. And Clay had contacted Harry, my editor, about a book that they had published called Seasons at Eagle Pond by Donald Hall, the great poet and essayist. I love Donald Hall. I love his poetry. I love his essays. And I had read Seasons at Eagle Pond, a lovely little meditation on place. And Clay contacted Harry and he said, "Hey, Harry, can we get Bob to write a book about his place that's kind of like Seasons at Eagle Pond and along those lines?" And I thought, well, maybe so. So I went back and I read Eagle Pond again, and I came to a quotation by Donald Hall about where he lived by Kearsarge Mountain in New Hampshire. And he said, "In the end, there is no reason to live here except for love." And I said, well, that's why I'm here too. I guess I can write this book. And so when I finished this passage by saying that all these things seem a lot like love to me, and they're important to me as love, and in fact, that's what they are. It's true. And the last image I gave you was the spring azure butterflies coming out, as in Robert Frost's poem, in which he says, Blue Butterfly Day, he says, "With all these sky flakes down in flurry on flurry, the flowers, they'll show more color than flowers will do for weeks, unless they hurry." So he's talking about these chips of sky coming down, the spring azure butterflies, and that's what it's been here this very week. It's been a cold, wet spring until this past week. The sun came out midweek last week, and it was like somebody pricked the balloon and all the blue butterflies came out. So good timing on that passage. Thank you.
Well, that actually sets the stage for a question that I really wanted to ask you specifically about this book. I mean, I'd say for most of us, your intimate, detailed portrait of the valley where you live goes way beyond the way that we normally experience our own daily lives. And it seems to me, and tell me if you agree, that this is sort of a combined result of your keen powers of observation, your academic expertise in ecology and the environment, and your also 40 plus years of living in Grays River Valley. So I guess other than experiencing this vicariously through your books, what can the rest of us do to experience in some measure this kind of intimacy with our own daily lives?
Wonderfully stated and well asked, Dave. And it goes right to the heart of my writing and right to the heart of my body and my thoughts. And so And I'll say, yes, I do connect with such closeness to it that some people frankly would find it tedious unless they too can take pleasure in the intimate details of the physical world. Although I always try to put it in a story context to lighten it so it's not strictly description page after page. But I think that I have that inclination because I feel, and I will not make any comparisons between myself and the master, but Henry David Thoreau wrote, I want to, in Walden early on, in the early part of the book, he said, I went to the woods because I want to live deliberately. And I've always felt that since I was a boy. I wanted to live deliberately in close connection with the real physical details around me. And there's butterflies and seashells from the very beginning, but I lived in Colorado, which was a dumb place to be a young oncologist. So I switched over to see the butterflies, and they were more rewarding. Do you know, the place that took me in when I was a boy was an old farmed out field and array of old farmlands east of Denver. I was in one of the earliest post-war subdivisions on the east side of Denver, blocks away from the Great Plains. But to escape our suburban grid, I walked out to the country where my brother had found a ditch. It was a little water course that took water from the mouth of the Platte River out onto the plains, watering the farms as it went. And it was a major early water diversion in Colorado. Now there's so much diversion of water in Colorado that it's no longer important for that, but it's an important greenway in Denver. But in those days, all the kids sneaked out to the ditch for whatever they could find because there was water, and that meant there was life, and that meant there was adventure. And that's where I found my butterflies. That's where I became a naturalist. And that's how I learned to connect intimately to place. Out of that came a book. It was the book before Where Bigfoot Walks. It was called The Thunder Tree, Lessons from an Urban Wildland, also edited by Harry Foster. It was a memoir, not of me, but of the place where I grew up. And I make the point in that book, same one that Richard Louv has made so forcefully in his more recent book, The Last Child in the Woods, Saving Our Children from Nature Deficit Disorder, that there is a special place in the background of most people who connect closely to the world. Most people who care about the land and the water and the sky and the creatures and the plants have a special place they can relate to. It's not always a wilderness. It could be a dippy little ditch on the plains like mine, or it could be a vacant lot, because what's less curious, excuse me, what is less vacant to a curious kid than a vacant lot, the universe in a vacant lot. Or if a kid is lucky, it could be the back 40 or I had friends on the other side of Denver who could walk into the Rockies. That guy and I, we each wrote books about North American butterflies in later years, but I came from a prairie ditch and he came from the mountains, even though he lived in the same city. So my advice, if I can be so bold as to answer your question that directly, is to go back in your mind to that place that you so deeply connected to in childhood, whether it was your grandmother's backyard, your own backyard, just a place underneath a spreading willow tree, or maybe a vacant lot or a hill or a rock or a mound or a creek, or it doesn't even have to be dominated by plants and animals. It could be an urban place too, but a place, a rooftop or under the boardwalk, or a place where there are all those wonderful old pop songs about special places for people. Up on the roof, under the boardwalk. They're not all natural history places, but they are, because nature is everywhere. The point is to have a place that you attend to every day and take in its intimate details. And any of us can start that. Now, maybe you didn't have such a place as a kid. Maybe you've been longing for it all your life. Maybe now life's too busy. But what better time than this past year? And I know a lot of people have found this, to connect or to reconnect to the green, to the wet, to the wild. And any of us can do that any day when life becomes too much. Turn off the news, put down the current affairs, set aside your own personal cares to the degree that you can, and attend outside of yourself to the real physical details of a bounteous and generous earth. The other living things, the colors, the movements, We don't have to be able to put a name on everything. And the great author, Vladimir Nabokov, wonderful novelist and poet and lepidopterist also.
Really?
Oh, yes. I've got my biggest book of all. It's over 1,000 pages, is called Nabokov's Butterflies. It's a compilation of all of his butterfly writing Lolita is full of butterfly writing. And Nabokov was a lepidopterist above all until he became a major writer. And then butterflies had to take a backseat, but all of his writing is full of butterflies. And I put together with his biographer a big book about it. It's a real treasure chest. But one thing I discovered in doing that book was an essay in which he wrote that he attended to the world, whether it was the characters in his novels or the butterflies in his collection and in his studies. And he did major studies by attending to here's the key word, their individuating details. That's what makes one thing different from another. Each of us different from one another, every grain of grass out there, different to a Walt Whitman, but it can be to us as well. So that's it, Dave. It's just paying attention. It's paying attention to the world around us and letting our own concerns and egos and selves. I'm not getting all zenny here and not at all woo-woo. It's very practical and it's very down to earth. Just allow yourself to be subsumed a little bit in the world around you. And it can make a remarkable difference in your outlook, in your health, and in your happiness.
Marvelous answer, Bob. Thank you very much. I've long loved the writing of Nabokov, and somehow I missed the fact that he was a lepidopterist.
I'll send you some stuff.
But that actually, your mention of Thoreau in particular reminded me of something else I was wondering about. You mentioned other nature writers, including Edwin Ray Teal and Charles Darwin, at various points in your writing, and even that you annually celebrate Darwin's birthday, which I thought was a wonderful idea. And I'm just wondering how you see, how you feel that their work may have influenced you, and also in terms of just your own style, this very sort of personal, intimate style that you use, for example, in describing the world of Gray's River. How would you say that that relates to the style of other nature writers, like, for example, John McPhee, who takes a much more sort of, I don't know what you call it, maybe journalistic point of view, where he isn't personally so much involved in the telling of the story. He's more sort of Joycean narrator who's anonymous and refined out of existence, as Joyce liked to say.
That's right. Thank you. Another beautiful question. One that one could go on about, but I'll start with the very people you mentioned. Well, first, let me go back a little farther, because as a little boy, the things I read were Thornton Burgess bedtime stories. Bruce is nodding, he knows those too. That wonderful series, Chatterer the Red Squirrel, was my first. There's also a Peter Rabbit, of course, everybody has a Peter Rabbit, but he also had Paddy the Beaver and old Mr. J, Sammy J, old Mr. Crow, old Mr. Toad, and so on. And he had all these animals, and I wore those books out from the library. The thing about those books was the wonderful illustrations by, I can't think of the artist's name at the moment, but he was superb. But he put them in clothes. He put Sammy J in a top hat and old Mr. Toad in a waistcoat. But in spite of that, and in spite of the fact that they spoke to one another in the green meadows and by the little brook, they behaved very much as real animals do. And I'm pausing because a hummingbird just flew in my study, and I think it went out again. If it gets stuck in the window, I'm gonna have to take a break for a minute and catch it and put it out. I think it went back out again. Okay. And so the fact that my first author that I paid attention to really attended to the real details of the animals' lives, as well as dressing them up for kids' stories. But then I went on, I read a lot of books about otters, a book by Niels Lars. It was an old Swede called An Otter's Story. I read that 1,000 times. And it was a detailed life of a particular otter. And later I read Tarka the Otter by Henry Williamson, the great English landscape writer. A superb adult novel about the life of an otter. And again, of course, I love the detail, but I love the story that went along with it. But their styles did not end up becoming my style. When I was in ninth grade, well, earlier than that, actually, Life magazine ran a series on evolution. Imagine that, for a number of issues. And they were wonderfully illustrated with uh, is it Sennheiser, the artist at Yale who did the dinosaurs, the first murals of colored dinosaurs. What is it? Yeah. And but one of them was about Darwin. One of the issues was about Darwin, and it showed Down House, his home and his study with its round table and his pigeons on it and things, and the sand walk that he took to study the movements of earthworms in the soil and to zen out between all of his work. I fell in love with Darwin as a person and the way he approached the world. And so in ninth grade, I put a copy of The Origin of Species in my back pocket that I bought, believe it or not, at our local drugstore. That doesn't happen these days. And I carried it around for a couple of years, read almost all of it. Couldn't understand some of it then, some of it I could. But Darwin was a very large influence on me in how to look at the world in all of its particulars and ask the right questions to understand better. I don't think any naturalist or biologist has been a greater influence on any living biologist than he. But his style I did not adopt, although recently I did compose a long poem called The Voyage of the Beagle that is recorded in an album that I did with a musician, a wonderful guitarist, Chris Novoselic. And that poem is entirely Darwin's words from The Voyage of the Beagle. I compressed that 600-page book, 5 years on the sea and the land, into a 1 8-minute poem entirely drawn from Darwin's language. So he was a beautiful, graceful writer as well. Parts of his style I love to emulate. And then, yes, a little later on, I started reading the major American nature writers, John Muir, Thoreau, of course, and then the 20th century people like Edwin Way Teale. And Teale did make an enormous influence on me. I first tried to emulate John Muir, but everything was glorious and grand and astonishing, and it wasn't good writing that I was doing. His writing was good at the time, but it wasn't, it was a model though. It was a model. And then I moved on to more the subtler writings of the 20th century, like Edwin Way Teale, who wrote the American Season series that was the first nature writing to win the Pulitzer Prize. Teale I got to know when I lived back in Connecticut. I bugged him until he finally admitted me to his sanctum out in the woods of near Hampton, Connecticut. And I ended up with three visits at his knees that were very, very, very influential to me. But I would not say I emulate his style. Another major influence on me at the time was a writer named Anne Zwinger, who wrote Beyond the Aspen Grove, a wonderful Colorado story about the place she loved. And it told me the books such as I might like to write could still be written and were still published. And Anne I later became friends with and become co-jurors with on a nature writing awards panel. But again, her style wasn't my style, but her approach to the world was. You mentioned John McPhee. Anne was a little closer to John's style. John McPhee writes about everything, and absolutely masterfully so. Most of his things have first appeared in the New Yorker and then later in books, many different subjects. Some of them oriented toward the so-called natural world, many toward the other part of the natural world, which is the more human part. But John steps way back. He's very self-effacing. He's almost transparent to the process, as a good journalist would be. And yet it's not quite journalism because he does express, ultimately, his own judgments and values. However, he does it extremely subtly, and he doesn't use the first person very much, and he doesn't state things outright as his opinion. He lets the reader come to that. I've interviewed John, and I learned something about how he does that. But he's almost alone in mastering that technique of the elegant essay in which the essayist is almost not present. I'm much more toward the essays of the 15th century Frenchman, help me, I want to say Monteau, but it's obviously not Monteau. Similar to that. Anyway, he started the modern essay with the French word essayer, which means to try. And he wrote the first real personal essays. It'll come to me a little bit later, in the 15th and early 16th centuries. To say my style's like his or like Charles Lamb's would be foolish, because I would never achieve that. And of course, it was hundreds of years removed, but it's more like that in that they very much involve themselves as the observer, as the person giving the opinion. And I write a personal kind of nonfiction. I'm not a good journalist because I can't keep myself out of it enough. The journalist really should exclude his or her own opinions or their opinions from the page, and be as transparent as possible. It's hard to achieve. In these days of the web, it's almost been given up on in the kinds of reportage we have these days. But I love the essay because you can be a person, you can give your opinion, you can give your own view, your own flavor on things, and yet you can then step back and give fact that people can take to the bank. However, if you do that, you have to convey to the reader when you're making that shift, so that they understand when you're being the poet and the joker or the opinionated cheerleader, and when you're being the reporter. And you can do that in the same essay, but you have to be careful. And the way you do that is through context. So my style is one I guess I would liken more to a modern writer like Barbara Kingsolver. I do write fiction too, of course, and her fiction is full of the kind of natural history that that her nonfiction is. But it's personal in that she brings herself and her own view into it, whether it's fiction or nonfiction. I love the poem. I write a good deal of poetry these days because it's extraordinarily personal and I can get myself right into it. What I reject, however, and I very much hope that I do not violate, is I don't have much patience for personal writing which is self-aggrandizing or self-promoting, and if anything, mildly self-denigrating, not denigrating, but defacing posture, where one's just as glad to take the mickey out of oneself as anybody else, is, I think, a lot more readable to anyone out there. And I hope that my books do not suffer the reader's patience to examine me as if I were trying to promote myself. I hope not, but I'm not afraid to be personally involved in my writing.
Yes, that definitely comes across. Is Montaigne the one that you were looking for the
Thank
essay?
you, Montaigne, of course. Thank you so much. Yes,
I-
got it confused with with where Nabokov used to live at Montreux. Montaigne, of course.
I remember one particular passage from John McPhee where you're talking about, does he ever sort of insert himself into the thing? He was talking about the lava tubes in Hawaii and how he was looking over the edge of the lava tube and said it was the most impressive aspect of nature he'd ever seen. And I thought, coming from John McPhee, that's quite a statement.
That's a lot. That really slipped in. Yeah, he worked very, very hard to avoid that sort of personal judgment. And he does it. And one of the questions I asked him when I interviewed him was about those kinds of things. He says, I like to let the reader come to the reader's own opinion of things. Now, if I've done a good job, that opinion may very well be the same one I share, but I'm not going to feed that to the reader.
Very good, very good. Well, I'd like to check in for a second with Tina and see if we have any questions.
Would this be a good place, Dave, to do my middle reading before we take the questions?
Yeah, I just wanted, just in terms of those looking ahead in terms of time, I mean, I have an endless list of questions here and you've got more that you want to read, but I just wanted to.
You know what, I think I'm going to skip the middle reading, because that will take time that we could take with questions with people. Let's do that.
Well, let's see from Tina. What
Dave,
do we
right
have?
now, I don't have any questions from the audience. What about you, Veronica? Do you have any questions that's directed to you?
You're muted, Veronica.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I don't have any questions from the reader, but I I wanted to ask you like a personal thing. Does the rain get to you? I love Grays River. I've been, Googling the area, so I know the streets and feel through your writing and through the help of Google, I feel I'm getting to know Grays River. But I wanted to ask you, does rain get to you?
Oh boy, perfect question. I mean, touche. In a word, yes. Now, do I love the rain? Yes. My earlier book, Wintergreen, which I consider sort of the mother of Skytime, or Skytime sort of the daughter of Wintergreen, is about the whole Willapa Hills in which I live. Now, this is the southwest corner of Washington State, and we get the rainfall just as the Olympic Mountains to the north do. Coming off that, somebody's mute is not on, and we're getting background noise. I'm not sure. Anyway, coming in from the sea, the clouds hit the hills and drop their water. So we're in the maritime rainforest. And in Grays River, we get up to, and actually beyond, I tell people a full 2 meters of rain a year. 120 inches, 10 feet of rain. 10 feet. Wow. Whereas in Colorado, where I grew up, it was 18 inches. So it's almost an order of magnitude more rain than I grew up with. Now, I came here because of the rain and the green and the moss and the ferns. My mother grew up in Seattle, which gets very little rain compared to here. And my grandmother was a pioneer teacher in Washington in green places. So I heard about these green places. And as I say in the Thunder Tree, after my 18th dry Denver March, brown, dry Denver March, I wanted the green. And that's why I came up to the University of Washington, one of the main reasons. Did the rain get to me the first year? Darn right it did. That first April in Seattle was rain the whole time. And oh man, I thought, well, I guess I got what I was asking for. Then I moved down here to where there's a great deal more rain than Seattle or Portland. 4 or 5 times more than Seattle or Portland have. They're arid places by comparison. So, but Wintergreen's all about rain. And in fact, in one chapter, I've got a whole vocabulary of rain that I have built based on the old Finnish and Indian terms and so on, to try to catch up with the analytic 100 words for snow business. I've made up my 100 words for rain. There's a wonderful song by a folk singing group over in Astoria about rain, and they absolutely peg it. And there's a tourist coming through, and it's so beautiful. It looks like the picture behind you, Veronica. They say, I think I could live here forever. And the local person looks at her and says, and how do you feel about rain? Because it just rains and rains and rains. It's not incessant. We'll get entire months of February sometimes that are sunny or semi-sunny. We can have a sunny day any year, any day of the year. However, the thing that kind of irritates me is that so far the pattern I think I'm seeing with climate change here. Now, it's very hard to discern patterns from weather fluctuation. I understand that. And I'm very, very conservative in doing so. But I've been here 42 years. And I've seen a lot of fluctuation. I've seen a lot, and I have seen some actual shifts. I've seen some changes in butterfly flight periods that I can document over that period of time. And I believe the data will show that it's in response to climate changes. But the effect it seems to be having on us is not warmer, not sunnier, but more La Nina years in the sea, more sea weather changes that are causing wetter, colder winters for us. So with global warming, we seem to be getting longer, colder, wetter winters and later springs. And so the last 6 springs, we haven't had the sun spells in March and April that we normally before that got. And the butterflies have been slow in coming out. And darn right, I got fed up with the rain. But as I say, the past week has been glorious. So maybe it's just a hiccup. I don't know.
Enjoy it.
The rain gets to, yeah, the rain gets to me. It'd be unfair to say it doesn't. But on the other hand, I don't get really depressed. I don't think I get SADD. And I do go out, get sunshine, take vitamin D. And I love the colors, patterns, sounds, and smells of the rain.
Rain.
It is one reason I don't get enough exercise, though, I'll be honest.
I do have another question. You touched on the global warming and its effects that you can witness in Grays River. Some of the things that you mentioned, like the sturgeon season, so do you see more of impact of global warming that you notice besides the rain, with things like the sturgeon, the fish in the environment that you have there?
I don't think that I've seen anything in the lower Columbia watershed or the Willapa Hills, my area of modest expertise, that I feel I could with confidence attribute to global warming, other than a modest sea level rise, which is continuing.
Mm-hmm.
And that will be of great consequence in time.
Mm-hmm.
It's not very great yet here. And as I say, some butterfly flight period changes that I can actually document with my own data over 40 years.
Mm-hmm.
And birds moving north. No, and some butterflies. I mean, some of the changes that we can see and document and are certainly connected to changing regimes of warmth and cold are immigration, and they're additive rather than subtractive. So in the past very few years, the first the brown pelicans and then the white pelicans have moved into the lower Columbia. They were never there before. In the past 2 years, the black phoebe, common bird in the Bay Area, flycatcher, pretty black and white thing, always catching the butterflies when you're trying to look at them. They have moved into my valley. I saw the first one I ever saw in the valley 2 years ago. This year there were 6 or 8 breeding pairs in the valley. Never seen here before. The black-shouldered kite also coming north. So far up here, the changes have been more additive than subtractive.
That's
now,
great.
Probably there will be some other species, and it may well be the sturgeon. Now with the salmon, however, we are having, of course, there's been many different crises with the salmon over the years, and the biggest one is the dams on the Columbia, which give us our cheap power. But the salmon are having some very difficult times because of sea warming and the loss of the cold weather invertebrates and small fish that they commonly feed on. And also the influx of warm weather animals. A lot of species of ocean creatures are coming north trying to find food. And Arctic species are coming south trying to find food. And they're all converging in the North Pacific.
Wow.
Which causes a great deal more competition to the salmon. And it's one of the reasons that several of the salmon runs are endangered and fading, although they'll have a blip and there will be a lot one year, and then the next year they crash again. So yes, I think your question is exactly right. I don't know about sturgeon yet. They're bottom feeders and they stick around, but the anadromous fish, particularly the salmon, are definitely taking it in the neck because of changing marine temperatures. And then the acidification of the sea. We don't have coral reefs here, but we are having a disease that's killing off most of the sea stars, the starfish, in a really big way in the North Pacific tide pools. That's been very dramatic. And I believe the current consensus is that has to do with the disease, but disease that is exacerbated by water temperature changes. So yes.
Thank you. It's good to know, and it reminds all of us that yes, it's real, and we should all take actions to mitigate the impact.
Yes, take actions to mitigate the impact by all means. I'm glad we're going back into the Paris Accords and everything else. Whether or not there's time to get it done and resolve to get it done, Who knows? I'm not the biggest optimist in the world that way, but I do express a kind of optimism in wintergreen and sometime in skytime too, that nature is resilient. Nature will resolve these things to its own satisfaction.
Mhm.
Whether or not that will be to our satisfaction as well is an entirely different question. We won't see the end of nature. We may see the end of some species, certainly in our environments. But that's another reason, by the way, to be enormously attentive to the world around you. Oh yeah, that hurts.
Mhm.
Ed Abbey, was it Ed Abbey said, sorry, Aldo Leopold, another great influence on me, by the way, Dave, the writer named Aldo Leopold with The Land Ethic in Sand County Almanac. He said, to be ecologically aware is to live in a world of wounds. That's very stark, but very real. And loss is all around us. We'll talk about monarchs in a minute. It's not a happy story. And
Mhm.
we are in a world of wounds. And so you might say, looking at everything around you just makes you crazy and hurts too much. On the other hand, lots of things are persisting or growing or coming in that weren't there before. They might not be the ones we want. They're still fascinating. They're still interesting. The world will remain fascinating. The world will remain succoring and supportive if we're attentive to that. We may have to accommodate both loss and love together, but since when have people not done that? And really, that's what Skytime is about. It's about accommodating both loss and love. I live in a land of logging where loss is an everyday feature. And that's when people come here, and I tell them, don't come because of this book,
Mhm.
but some do anyway. And certainly some did because of wintergreen. And some stay and some don't. But the ones that don't, it's two reasons. They can't take the rain or they can't take the clear cuts or the isolation.
What's the second one again? I couldn't hear it.
The clear cut logging.
Ah.
The logging, it's too visually upsetting to a lot of people. This is a land of logging and a land of private forests.
Mhm.
So while there are always forests and there are very few people, which I love,
Mhm.
there are 4,500 people in my whole county and not a single traffic light. And the services yet are great and the valleys are beautiful. But when you look up to the hills, it's not the redwoods, it's not the Cascades, it's not the Olympics. It's the clear-cut Willowpaw Hills. It's basically one big tree farm in different stages of cutting and growth. Now, I have come to find a certain beauty in that, not to exonerate it, not to say it's all okay. And I've criticized some of the logging practices and promoted better ones that are for the people's sake as well as the woods. But it's a messy process. It doesn't make a pretty landscape everywhere. It's beautiful in my valley, yes, gorgeous. And some of the hills around it are quite pretty. And we have saved some of the old growth stands, what there's left, and there's not much. But if you go around in these hills, you're confronted with a lot of removal of trees for the fiber that we all use. They like to call it a working landscape. I don't really like that because I like to think a preserved wilderness is working awfully hard too. It's sequestering carbon, it's working for all the animals and plants that live there. But in another sense, in a commercial, jobs and products that we all depend upon, it's working in that sense. And some people can't take that. They want it to be a park. And it's never going to be a park. And
Well,
that,
Bob, you mentioned just a minute ago that we wanted to be sure and get to the monarchs before we ran out of time. And I just wanted to, since time is getting a little short, to make sure that you have an opportunity to talk about that.
that's right. And my end reading is only about 30 seconds long, so we'll be good there. So
Great.
let's mention monarchs for a minute. Tomorrow I'm going to be on a Zoom panel for the Point Reyes Birding Festival.
Oh.
But it's with 3 monarch authorities. Mia Monroe, a great ranger from Muir Woods National Monument, who's kind of Ms. Monarch of California. Cheryl Schultz, who's a professor at Washington State University and does serious scientific research on endangered butterflies, including monarchs, and myself. I'm more of a historian of the Western monarchs. I've done some biology with them. And we're talking about whether we're losing the Western monarchs as a phenomenon, as a migratory phenomenon. There are two schools of thought right now. The last two winters, the monarch colonies at Pacific Grove, Monterey, Santa Cruz, and elsewhere, Santa Barbara, have collapsed to mere thousands, and many of them none at all. And that's down from millions many years ago, and hundreds of thousands through the 80s and 90s. Collapsed. And last year, there wasn't a single monarch observed in Washington state, whereas usually there are hundreds or thousands that come up from California, most of them. Some may come up from Mexico, whose numbers are down too, but not quite as critically, about 90%, but not 100%. In California, they're down almost 100%. And what is that all about? Well, the one school of thought represented by one monarch biologist is that they're adapting to change, that the migration will resume. It'll pick up again when conditions are a little bit better. And meanwhile, the monarch is becoming resident in the Bay Area. It's becoming a backyard butterfly in the Bay Area and elsewhere in coastal California, away from the actual coast, where it's feeding on the milkweed that Bruce and many other good people have planted, because there's been a great deal of plea for people to plant milkweeds. But the problem is we might be defeating ourselves to some extent, especially by planting the tropical milkweed, which is the one that's most readily available. There's a big lobby to use it because they know the monarchs love it. Problem is it blooms year round, and it makes green, lush vegetation year round. And so the monarchs coming down from the north, they see this, plus it's warmer at the coast than it used to be. They need it to be cool at the coast to keep them in more or less suspended animation during the winter. They don't want to be active. They want to save the fat they built up, migrating south, nectaring, until Valentine's Day or so, when they break the clusters and mate and start back north again. It should be cool in the fog and the mist of the coast. But it's warmer now. The sea is warmer. The onshore winds are warmer. Might not feel that way sometimes in San Francisco in January, but the trend is warmer. And those cluster sites are not keeping the monarchs. Instead, they're coming down to all this milkweed that people planted. And a lot of it's tropical milkweed. And they're saying, oh, well, I might as well just breed here. And why migrate? So we may be a real factor in actually ending the Western monarch migration. And I really do fear that unless we see some real adaptive change with the monarchs and recovery quite soon, maybe some refreshment from the Mexican monarchs. We now know through my research that some of the Mexican monarchs do come into California. And it may be that in certain years, they refreshed the monarchs. Now, the monarchs did crash back in 96, and then in 97, they recovered. And our hypothesis is that it was through Mexican monarch refreshment. But we don't know that for sure. And that might or might not happen again. We may simply be seeing the rapid, and this is the thing about Darwin. Darwin thought that evolution always happened gradually. And we now know that he was generally right, but he didn't know about punctuated equilibrium that they came up with at Harvard, Stephen Jay Gould and others, that evolution can go in big, quick hits, sometimes if conditions are right. And we may be seeing the microevolution of a new phenomenon for Western monarchs right in front of our faces in 2 years, not 2 centuries, not 2 eons, not 2 million years, 2 years of the monarch becoming a stay-at-home backyard suburban butterfly like the Gulf fritillary or the pipevine swallowtail. People will still have monarchs around. It's not going to become extinct. It's lots of places in the world as a non-resident. But are we losing the grandest insect migration phenomenon ever known? I think so in California. I fear so. And the Mexican one will hold out longer, but they're being pushed farther and farther toward the tops of the cold mountaintops. And I don't know if we'll be able to, if the Mexican one will persist or not. We'll have to watch. It's down by about 90%. It's still worth going to and seeing. There's still a lot of them, relatively speaking, but nothing like what it was. I fear, though, we may be losing the Western migratory monarch phenomenon. So sorry to finish up on a downer like that.
Mm.
But all the more reason to fall in love with your backyard, pay more attention to your surroundings, and it may be that you'll have the monarch now as a backyard butterfly. Instead, it's still a wonderful neighbor to have.
So can you tell us which species of milkweed that we need to purchase?
Yes, if you are going to plant milkweed for the monarchs, I recommend planting the species called Asclepias fascicularis. It's called the narrow-leaved milkweed. Some call it the Mexican whorled milkweed, WHORLED, or the narrow-leaved milkweed, but it's fasciculatum, fasciculatus, and that's native. However, it's not native all that close to the coast. So where do you live, Bruce?
Right in between San Francisco and San Jose, Redwood City.
Well, you're good. You're good there. You're not so close to the wintering grounds, and you know, a lot of people are planting the tropical. So that horse may be out of the pen, out of the barn by now. I don't know, but to do the best thing for the monarchs, I would plant the narrow-leaved milkweed. You can also plant the one called the showy milkweed, Asclepias speciosa. That has a bigger, fancier flower, and I think that's native in the lower Bay Area. I'm pretty sure, but certainly fascicularis is. You know what, Bruce? Go to the Xerces Society website, xerces.org. They've got a milkweed finder.
Oh.
They've got a monarch conservation section, and they've got a milkweed finder that will help you find just the right milkweed for where you are.
Wow, great. What a good
Excellent.
resource.
Thank you.
You're very welcome.
Well, I think we have to wrap up now, Tina. That's correct, right?
Yes, we have 2 minutes.
All right.
Thank you so much.
I'm going to read this last paragraph here, if I may.
Great. Yes, please.
Thank you all so much for coming and sharing my beloved place with me. With the coming of the germ, this is from the new part in the new book, just in time for this. With the coming of the germ this spring and the great shutting down, I had to wonder whether I, as a high-risk old guy, might be joining the great compost of the ages myself soon. But so far, so good. There are only 6 cases of COVID in the county. Now it's 106. Far more actual corvids, the crows and the ravens. There's no telling how it will change this valley, if at all. I plan to be here for a while yet, so maybe I'll find out. All I can say is that tonight, the honeysuckle, mock orange, and styrax are all blooming in a wild cascade of petal and scent, their combined fragrance almost overwhelming. The hummingbirds get drunk on them, and so do I. Yes, it's just that kind of a place.
Mm.
And I know
Wonderful.
your place is for you too, so love your own place, and thank you for sharing mine with me.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pyle.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dave. For
Thanks,
moderating
Dave.
the
Thank you,
conversation.
Veronica, and thank you, Dave.
Yeah,
Thank you all for
really
coming.
appreciate your spending this time with us, Bob. And I'm sure, I certainly look forward to further exploration of your many writings, and I'm sure many of the others present here today will too, many of the other attendees. So thank you again, and hope we'll see you again soon one of these days.
Thank you, and all of you be well.
You too.
Be
Thank
safe.
you. Thank you.
So
Thank you.
much. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Great
Bye-bye.
job, Dave. Thank you.
Thank you.